Hi all, I have an absolutely epic game to show you today. Leela playing against the mighty Stockfish. So all games up until this game, they were all drawn between the two, with Stockfish leading TSEC season 15. So 5 draws, I believe. And this game, Leela is playing white. We have D4. So Leela ID 41800. And Stockfish as of the 19th of April, version of 19th of April 2019. So we have here knight f6, the king's engine defense is entered into. So the book moves given to both. This is all book moves. The Simish king's engine, so this is after Frederick Simish, who once lost a lot of games on time in the tournaments. That was one of the stories, and he's been involved in other opening variations like the Simish against the Nimzo engine. So this idea of f3 is very, very interesting, and it's one that I've used quite a lot as well with great enjoyment. So after bishop e3, like when playing against Sicilian Dragon, you're ruling out the use of the g4 square from black. You're preparing simply to create a battery and exchange off quite often the dark square bishop to kind of make these dark squares more vulnerable. So there's a basic undertone of a crude kind of plan there, and often castling queenside. So it was one of my favourites systems against the king's engine. We have a6 here, being book given to them still, a6. There's 3 viable alternatives. c5 has been seen before. For example, this has been seen before. White is supposed to have a small edge. Knight c6 immediately, and it can transpose into the a6. So this is known, and white's got a small edge generally. Or e5 immediately, encouraging d5. And this position is quite interesting. White again could have a small edge here. So we have a6. It's a very good move generally. Queen d2, knight c6, knight ge2, bishop d7. This is the end of the book given to both of them. And now we have knight c1. Now knight c1 strengthens white's control in a way of the b5 square. So if black's preparing something like rook b8 and b5, that's locked down a bit here. It also sometimes means knight b3 controlling the d4 square, which means that if ever black plays e5, white can react with d5 and have that control of d4, so no knight d4. So it's a pretty standard move in this type of position, knight c1. As an example, if white had castled queenside instead, then b5 here is actually pretty good for black, because a2 is vulnerable here in some of the variations. And if knight d5, this kind of thing, okay, white might be okay, but why give black this counterplay? And even worse, if c takes, then black's going to get a big advantage like this kind of thing, with even e takes possible, and then later f5 with not just the diagonal, the a file. This is not the position you want. Basically, you want to minimize black's counterplay, especially if you're going to be castling on the queen side. So Leela does a very good move, not casting immediately, it seems. Knight c1. Now black commits to e5. If rook e8, then as mentioned, knight b3 strengthens that d4 square. So any e5 now d5, unless black wants to just give up pawn for virtually nothing, then this position, in fact, the knight is also useful for pushing through with c5 here with a big positional advantage. So this is the underminable part of the pawn chain, the most exploitable base. And if d6 goes, e5 is weaker, and that echoes through a lot of King's Engine games, the battle to undermine each other's pawn chains. So anyway, e5, d5, so e5 immediately, d5, knight d4, and now it's too dangerous to take on d4. Black's getting a lot of play, and in fact with the king in the center, there might even be really dangerous tactics. This is just giving black, huge things like knight takes e4 potentially, and then rook e8. It's just, you wouldn't think of doing that basically as white. It would be absurd. So basically you want to minimize counterplay generally. And so here, after knight d4, the knight goes back to e2 to challenge that knight. Now Also, I mean, b3 has been seen before, white accepting double pawns. This kind of thing might also be quite pleasant for white. There's still the c5 break, and in fact that pawn is now being used for the c5 operation, and that's plausible as well. But this is good as well, knight e2. Now, Stockfish played knight takes e2. Playing c5 for trying for some dynamic play doesn't really work. D takes, and then taking on d6 is fine for white to do. There's no backfire here. So knight takes e2, bishop takes e2, and you can see that white has really good control over b5 here, and the possible use of c5. So knight h5, white does castle queenside here, f5, and now king b1. Now I've often enjoyed games in this position. When you play king b1 and black ever plays f4, quite often white can just simply play on the queen side because black has released that tension on the center, kind of giving you a free hand on the queen side, and that's where white has more space. That's where the pawn chain points. As a general rule, where the pawn chain points is where you want to build up your pressure and increase your pressure and open up lines. And it's on the queen side, in fact, if black releases the tension, that the bishop drops back and you can start playing for c5, generally speaking, if it was a human game. But at the moment, black is not compelled to play f4, releasing that tension. And you might think, well, isn't white foregoing the attacking opportunities that I mentioned earlier with bishop h6? That's true, but it's adapting to the position. If black's going to close up there, then okay, black has increased king safety, but has reduced counterplay in the center when you play the flank attack on the queen side. So here we see knight f6 putting more pressure on e4. So white is kind of tied down to e4 here, and a strengthening move is played, bishop d3. Stockfish reacts with queen e7. You might think, well, is taking plausible? After knight takes, it gives white really a comfortable position. This is quite a comfortable position. There's no real entry points on the f-file. The bishop is hemmed in by its own pawn on e5. This is pretty comfortable for white. And in fact, white could play like h4 and still actually have an attack without the f pawn as a shield. There's still now back to the crude elements of the original plan with h5, take out the bishop, maybe sacrifice later on the h file. So that's really dangerous. So black played queen e7. We have queen c2, a really nifty positional move. So Leela is really positively encouraging now with this pressure, this battery on the f5 pawn, for black to release the tension. In fact, Stockfish does now release the tension, and the question can start to be posed: is black being strategically crushed? Is this already positionally becoming crushing if black has no real play on the king side and is just waiting for white to build up on the queen side? It seems a big strategic commitment to play f4. However, f takes e4, as we've noted before, this kind of position, white still now got attacking prospects. And still can play, in fact, on both sides of the board in this scenario with c5 as well as h5 imminent. And apparently a move like rook h3 is very dual purpose, not just for h5 but sometimes switching the rook over to the c file. So with very flexible rooks in this position, maybe sometimes for both sides amusingly, but white ends up being better. Basically, if the black rook's showing flexibility as well, it's the c pawn which is a big target in this scenario, and white could end up with a big advantage just with the c pawn as well. And also, of course, the bishop is tied down. With this move like rook h5 hitting e5 all the time, then the bishop can't really lend a hand that easily as well. So these scenarios really perhaps encourage black, Stockfish, to kind of release the tension. This free hand given for white on the queen side. So it's very interesting. If one can consider this as strategically winning, if black strategically lost here in a certain regard. Rook a b8, we have king a1, rook fc8. If black tries to do the active b5 here, it seems as though white can play queen b3, and even it doesn't really matter about b4 knight a4, but let me just show you b takes this position, c7's attacked, and it's very, very comfortable for white. In fact, with a move like bishop c2 and bishop b3, this is just really solid for white, with that c-file pressure and the queenside generally. But also, let's have a look on b5, queen b3. Any b4, it does seem in some variations as though knight a4 was on the cards, because if queen e8, then at least there's bishop c2 sometimes and supporting that knight, and still with c5, so it's still very comfortable potentially. So anyway, rook fc8. That was an unchecked variation, by the way. I hope that's correct. Most of the variations you'll find in the annotated PGN. So rook fc8, we have g4. Now here h6 is played. On f takes g3, h takes g. This is very good for the pressure on the king side, and in fact white can still play with c5 here, for example like this, and then g4 even. This position is going to be very nice for white. Once that c5 goes, black's pawn chain is absolutely wrecked in this scenario. Look at it, how diced it is. White's got a big advantage structurally. And it's structurally that often Leela, it seems to be, to me, world class, the number one in terms of pawn structure and pawn management. So yeah, f takes, although it seems active, it gives less shield to the king, and there's all to play for white on both sides of the board basically. So h6 not taking up that opportunity. So g4 really reduces black's potential counterplay on the king side as well. h4, rook a8, it looks as though the whole king side is about to be locked down. If black plays g5 here, then queen e2, this position is very good for white. This is just a fictional scenario, white playing for c5 and even d6, because we've got tactics now like bishop c4 check and taking the queen if the queen had taken. So knight d5, this scenario is just really strong, where there's tactics again, d takes bishop c4 check, winning the queen. So there are very favourable scenarios if black plays g5. So black didn't commit to g5 as an example, just rook a8. So Stockfish is reduced, it seems, to waiting now. Can't play on the king side unless h5, which is still possible, more plausible than g5 basically. But the queenside punch c5 seems to be just hanging around here, and in fact rook c1 echoes that queenside break c5, which white can really prepare and play at the most effective time possible. Knight e2 getting out of the way of the queen, so looking at c5 again. We have h5, black does do something on the king side. This locks down the king side now. So really this free hand, it seems very tempting to just play c5 here. In fact, it's waited on with rook hd1. You might think, rook hd1, can't black batten down the hatches, b6? But there's always potentially things like b4 and c5 anyway. So maybe there's actually still no hurry for c5. We have rook cb8, rook d2, queen f7, knight c3, bishop f8. And in fact, yeah, it looks as though black is battening down the hatches. Look, it looks as though, you know, c5 is really dissuaded now. What is Leela doing? Is this a bit too casual? The thing is, the king side has been locked out now of the equation. So if white can totally optimize the c5 break, why not? And it seems as though this, if there were two rooks in front of the queen, this would be called the Alekhines gun. Is this very useful? Sometimes it is to double forces as a tactic in its own right. Doubling rooks or creating an Alekhines gun is a very, very powerful tactical construction. And here it can potentially make c5 more effective. We have knight g7 and now knight a4. So disregarding black's preparations for c5, just building up for c5 even more. So we have the knight building up for c5, the bishop's there, the rook's there, the partial Alekhines gun ready to take opportunities on the d file. The bishop's also ready to swing to c2 if there's a battering on the a4 knight. Now, black didn't bother with queen e8. Black played b5 in this position. If we just get an idea of bishop takes a4, which is a kind of sin in a way, giving up the light square bishop, because black's already very vulnerable now on the light squares, even more so without that bishop. This is not what black generally wants to do, but this plan of b4 would be even more effective if even the queens came off. This is still white with the bishop here is going to have a very, very juicy c5 coming up. So b5 was played. Slight downside of black's activity, it could leave a weak pawn which could be picked off later, potentially. And in fact, Leela doesn't want to activate black's rook necessarily, so plays just knight c3, teasing the pawns forward. We have, if, just as to illustrate, you don't really want to give the opponent counterplay. If c takes, then this position, in fact, is going to be very nice for black. As an example, this would be a way of black getting all the play, and that would wreck white's position. So knight c3 is important, trying to minimize the counterplay over here. Knight e8. In this position, if b4 here, knight a4 is possible, supporting c5. Knight on the rim is dim, but in this circumstance, if queen e8, bishop c2, that aforementioned resource, bishop c2 can come to the rescue there, and still white can play now for c5 at a juicy moment indeed. So knight e8 was played. We have bishop f1, king h8, queen b3, rook b7. On b4 here, again, knight a4 comes into play, and if a5 c5, this position white's getting a big advantage. There's a target, c5 and e5 have been weakened. There's no backward support, no pawn's going to support e5. It has to be pieces held up, protecting e5 later, as well as, you know, c7. So these pawns are major liabilities in this position. So we have rook b7, a3. Very, very nifty move indeed. And this morning I was looking at my iPhone very early in the morning, and someone was saying, A3, isn't that just like equalizing, that throwing away things? What's the point of A3? It turns out A3 is super nifty. I thought in some vague abstract sense A3 might support B4 and C5 at some point, but actually in practicality, more practical, the use of the A2 square for this route to D5 gives the option of hitting C6 en route to D5, and that is a very, very interesting finesse, as we're about to see. So bishop E7, rook DC2. So again, this build-up, what's happening here, where is... the commitment? Knight a2 is played, so it looks as though now knight b4 to c6 potentially is dangerous. c6 is played, so why did Stockfish commit to c6? If king h7, just to illustrate now as an example, if black just played a waiting move like king h7, queen c3, c takes, and now knight b4, this position, the knight going into c6, basically dislocates the b5 pawn here. That's a really juicy target here. So for example, rook c8, bishop takes b5, it's dropping off. It's dislocated. If bishop takes, queen takes, it's still, look at the light square bishop. Black's bishop is a prisoner inside the pawn chain, an absolute prisoner. If you look at this pawn chain, this is a nightmare. There's no kingside counterplay, there's no tension on the center. White's got the pure free hand, dislocated a pawn, and that pawn is going to be snapping off here with a big advantage. So yeah, black resorts to c6. Just to illustrate this a little bit more in this variation, pardon me, so in the king h7 waiting move variation, let's go to move 38 here. On instead of rook c8, oh, we've already said that, sorry. So c6, we have d takes c6, bishop takes, and now, yeah, knight b4, cute, rather than knight c3. It's hitting c6 en route to d5. So white is now got another thing to play for. This strategic square d5 doesn't just have a pawn on it, it can have a piece, a strong piece on it, hitting in all directions, reducing black's counterplay further. Although you could argue with c6, at least this bishop is given some light of day, that sometimes the bishop can come on this diagonal. But yeah, swings and roundabouts. Let's see, bishop d7. On knight, yeah, the bishop's hanging here, it has to be moved. So we have queen d3, not immediately going into d5, queen d3. We have a5, and now the knight goes into that beautiful square, knight d5. We have bishop d8. Okay, the bishop's got some light here, it seems. But now, here's c5. This undermines the pawn chain. It immediately challenges the structure, weakening e5. That is a pivotal support of the e5 pawn here, this d6 pawn. And also white's breaking through that c file as well. Queen c3, very nifty, not even taking on c5. Queen c3 immediately eyeing both c5 and e5. And black defends e5 with queen g7. And now we have bishop takes c5. Black is strategically busted, one could argue, in this position. Even though the bishop, okay, doesn't look entirely miserable. Look at white's pieces. By contrast, that huge knight on d5. We have b4, queen b3. On a takes, this will be a tactical disaster after check. No, just lose. No, Leela's not going to do that now. Maybe in the past. Queen b3, a4 is played. On b takes a3, queen takes. This variation with bishop c4 shows white dominating the position with that fantastic knight outpost. The bishops control key entry points like b3. Everything's pretty secure here, and in fact white can play invasive moves like this with a big advantage. So that's hitting that rook on a6, big advantage. It's very, very nasty scenarios for black indeed. As an illustration, here if king h7 a4, and here is an illustration where knight takes f4 becomes dangerous after bishop d4 pinning the queen against the king. So yeah, black cannot resort to waiting moves with the king. There are horrible things about to happen on some of these diagonals, for example like this, and then white crashing through the d file. So a4 is played. It is a commitment. Pawns don't go back. Is this going to be a target in the future, this a pawn? The queen goes to d3. B takes. Bishop takes a3. The pawn is constrained. It's blockaded. And when we talk about blockades, Nimzowitsch was a big fan of the blockade. We're talking about absolute control, not relative control. You know, you can control pawns from afar, but if you blockade them, you are making it totally legal for that fixed target to be moved. It really is a fixed target, cannot move. It's not just controlled, it's absolutely controlled. So is the a4 pawn a true liability in this position or not? Let's see. Rook b7, queen d1, looking at a4. Starting to look at a4, but also partially an Anakine's gun, because this rook can swing, and we look at the d file as well, and there could be terrible things with that d file for black in store. Queen f7, rook c5, queen g7, and now bishop c4, rook a7, bishop a2. Where is this bishop going? Rook b8, rook 5 to c3, rook a b7, rook d3. Bishop e6 is played here. Now white is actually threatening something quite subtle here. I wonder if you can spot what white is threatening if I gave you 5 seconds to pause the video. If white had another move, white could play knight c7 in some of the variations. Black played bishop e6. So for example, rook a8, bang, wham, bang. Knight c7 here, behold, rook takes, and then look, rook takes d7, crashing through the 7th rank, checkmating the queen. The queen has no squares here. It's been checkmated. The queen would have to be lost there. So that's on rook a8, bishop c8, knight b4, behold the power of the d file. Rook takes d8, for example, here, crashing through. And then taking and scooping up loads of material, crashing through the 8th rank. Bishop a5 is an example. Knight c7, crushing. So rook takes, then rook takes d7, back to checkmating the queen. Stockfish helpless here. So this move, bishop e6, desperate tactical circumstances, giving up that pawn, that fixed target, the blockaded pawn, the one which was totally under control from the blockade, is now dropping off the board. It's official. Leela is now material up, still with a very dominant position, superior pieces here. We have bishop d7. If bishop takes d5, then that drops the knight here tactically, just absolutely losing. So bishop d7 protecting the knight. The queen just drops back. So a pawn has been knocked off black's position. Is black getting to be in a critical state? The light square bishops come off the board. Does this help black? Black's still a pawn down. It's same colour bishop here. It's not even an opposite colour bishop scenario. we have queen f7, rook c6, infiltration, and also preparing to double rooks. But looking at g6 now laterally, as Nimzovich says, the point of infiltrating along files is to put pressure across the ranks from the infiltration squares. Rook a7, queen c2. We have knight g7. Rook c8, not minding an exchange of rooks, crashing to that 8th rank, pinning the bishop. Rook a8, rook takes, queen c6. The queen is now threatening things like queen d6, hitting the loose rook and hitting e5. If e5 drops, then f4 is under scrutiny. f4 will be severely weakened. We have queen e6. And in fact, this is a very desperate move because there's still an issue with e5 in this position. Leela just obliges with the queen exchange, because now bishop d6, forking the rook and e5. The rook plays a check to gain a tempo, but it doesn't help the e5 situation here. King g8, bishop takes e5. Leela is now 2 pawns up. Is this the end of Stockfish here? Is this the first official game in history that a neural network beating Stockfish in the main TSEC event, season 15? It looks as though Stockfish is in big trouble here. King f7. Another pawn bites the dust. Knight takes f4. 3 pawns down now, and it's not even opposite coloured bishops. Bishop e7. King c2. Rook a1. Rook d1. The rook goes back. Bishop e3. What's the technique here? Is it good? Rook d1. Rook a4. King d3. Rook b4. Bishop d4 holding b2. Check. The bishop drops back. White surely can just push these pawns now. Rook b1, rook a1, the rook coming for that a file rank to put lateral pressure if needed. f4, the pawns start being pushed. f5, rook f1, the rook doesn't use the a file, comes back here. The king comes in, king c4, f6, these pawns look absolutely huge. e5, black desperate to blockade them, to no avail it seems. Check, and the game ended here. Both engines reached the magic threshold for an auto declaration, an auto adjudication. Black basically lost now this game because based on the evaluations of both engines being above 10, I believe. Now, as the sample continuation, king d3, bishop c5, rook a8 is strong with the idea check, and then e6, and then in fact the bishop could be put back in prison and white can casually play for e7. So this could be a scenario. A fantastic win. This is a historic day in neural network chess history. This is a historically important game in my view. I hope you enjoyed it as much as me. If you did enjoy this game video, then please click on the top left box, which should appear shortly, to become a member at chessworld.net, which is my correspondence style site. Play against other YouTubers. You can also test yourself on the variations covered in this game and other games from the improved menu, the puzzle books option, which has a link to the annotated game. Comments, questions, donations, see description. Likes, shares, subscribes with the notification bell, really appreciated. Thanks so much.